Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and also the initiative, actually, for this seminar and the topics chosen. I'm very happy to speak on this second part of the seminar concerning European security and actually overall security. I chose a question for my speech, how to cope with your evil global neighbors, and I will try to answer it. Let's start in Russia. First of all, I think regardless of the concrete circumstances of the coming defeat of Russia and Ukraine, and likewise the concrete repercussions that this defeat might have for Russia's part, one outcome is clear at this point of time already. Russia will become an even weaker state and a country that is even more isolated from the Western world and its institutions. And actually, irrespective of whether Mr. Putin stays in power or is replaced, and likewise, irrespective of whether Russia can stay intact or as a united and cohesive polity or not, it will necessarily gravitate towards some kind of closer cooperation with China and the dictatorial regime in Beijing. If Putin will be replaced or not is also a secondary issue in this context. That is, if he should be replaced, there will still be no guarantee that his successor necessarily is a meeker or less revanchist or less expansionist ruler than he has been. A couple of examples from history shows us that when Louis XVI was replaced by Robespierre, and Robespierre in his turn was replaced by Napoleon, the world didn't get much safer. And as the Tsar was replaced, the Tsar Nikolai II was replaced by Kerensky, and then Kerensky replaced by Lenin, and Lenin then replaced by Stalin. Things didn't necessarily go better. So all in all, this will mean that in the world as a whole, we will face a strong dictatorship in China, colluding with a weaker dictatorship or some kind of chaotic governance in Russia. Two regimes that in their Weltanschauung will be very much the opposites of what we in the Western world see as many important topics, such as the relation between citizens, or rather in their case, between subjects and the state, the role of the state in the economy, the role of civil society, or rather, in that case, also the suppression of the civil society and its subjugation to the state. This is also why I think Ukraine matters. It is not just a local conflict in Europe that you don't or we don't need to be much concerned about, as some conservative profiles in the United States has described it. I have foremostly the Republican candidate J.D. Vance of Hillbilly Elegy of Ohio in mind. Because if Russia would be able to win in Ukraine, and thank God it will not, such a victory would give China a very strong signal about its design on the military conquest of Taiwan, and moreover also a signal concerning China's expansionist ambitions in the Pacific, mainly today around Australia and in the Solomon Islands. So going back to the pair of Russia and China, together with some of their client states such as Belarus or North Korea, we in the West will face a constellation of states that will encompass more than 1/4 of the landmass of the world and around 1/4 of the world's population. Two powers, two legitimate nuclear states, that is according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, and two members of the United Nations Security Council. It is thus for me also obvious that we cannot rely on the most common international institutions as the United Nations and other bodies in order to contain Russia and China. And it is probable also that these institutions will lose their already weakened legitimacy even more during the coming years, because they won't be the vehicles which with the international community can control or contain these states. How would we then cope with this? Well, as we have done previously, actually, by containment, by skillful diplomacy, and by being armed to our teeth. The very reason that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was founded in 1949 was the gradual Soviet expansionism in Eastern Europe after World War II. Also, up here in the north, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden sought to counter Soviet Russia's expansionist ambitions by trying to form a tripartite Nordic defense alliance. Finland was, I think, the single country bordering Russia which was among the losers of the Second World War and which still was able to avoid not being occupied by Moscow. So Finlandization was, in the correct interpretation of the term, a positive process of gradually moving out from the shadow of the giant and a former tormentor. However, Denmark and Norway chose to side with NATO and to depend on the American, French, and British nuclear deterrence rather than trusting Stockholm against Moscow. Sweden, for its part, retained a former policy of non-alliance, but established a secret collaboration with NATO, started its own developmental program for obtaining tactical nuclear weapons and their necessary carriers. Sweden also established the fourth largest air force in the world, with more than 1,000 fighter aircraft towards the end of the 1950s. But what was maybe even more important than arming against the Soviet threat and establishing a defense alliance of democracies was the understanding developed during that period that an international system that should withstand and contain the aggression could not only depend on Western democracies. Already Greece, and especially Turkey, that became members of the NATO in 1952, had both of them very questionable track records on freedoms and rights, and on rule of law, and multi-party democracy. Greece had just come out of a civil war between royalists and communists after the Second World War. Turkey, for its part, was a one-party state from its founding in 1923 until 1946. The first alleged multi-party elections conducted in 1946 were a sham and a window dressing exercise by a country who had been neutral during the whole World War II until it declared war in Germany in February 1945. It was when Moscow made territorial demands on Turkey in 1946, a country that Stalin correctly perceived was not on the winning side of the war, that Ankara came to understand that it had to align itself with the Western sphere. The shaky multi-party democracy of Turkey, with its recurring history of military coups and attempts thereof, its very questionable record on human rights, its suppression of minorities, and as of today, its one-man rule, is, regardless of that, Turkey is still an important part of the defensive alliance of the West. Other, even more dubious and problematic regimes and states, such as Iran under the Shah up to the 1970s, Pakistan, Indonesia, Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek, several authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, in Africa and Latin America, have historically been important cornerstones in the containment of the Soviet Union and also later of communist China. We, the West, did then not have the luxury to only choose as allies and partners states or countries that were identical or similar to us in their system of governance, rights, and freedoms. And we will not have that luxury today either. I think Ukraine is a very obvious example of this case. In 2021, according to Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, Ukraine ranked 122nd out of 180 countries, the second most corrupt country in Europe, with Russia as the most corrupt in place 136. Several Ukrainian mayors had been suspected of using their posts to serve their own business interest. The Ukrainian judicial system was described as rotten to its core. And in 2009, only 10% of the population of Ukraine trusted the system. Less than 30% of the Ukrainians thought it was possible to get a fair trial. Other sectors, such as higher education, the public sector, the public sphere, social security, and many others, showed similar traits. It is worth noting that isolationists in the United States and so-called neutrals in Europe usually point out these deficiencies and shortcomings and dysfunctionalities of the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian society as reasons why one should not support Ukraine against Russia's aggression or necessarily make a choice between two warring countries. However, that is, in Voltaire's wording, making the best an enemy of the good. Also, in our close future today, we will need to have a non-utopian and realistic view in the affairs of the world. So how does one cope with evil global neighbors? Well, as we have done historically, by preparing for the worst, by aligning with friends, by arming ourselves, by isolating our enemies, and by being prepared to have to choose between lesser evils, by being prepared to get our hands dirty, if so necessary. Thank you.